go lower?
It's continuity. I bet everyone makes that joke. Perhaps
That's good, yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, David. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm slightly disappointed now that I don't get any fancy dress, but maybe next time. So the main thing I'd like to talk about this evening is finitude and a certain violence that comes along with the notion of infinite potential or inexhaustible power in finitude. And one of the reasons why I've come to this question, why I'm interested in the work I'm going to talk about, is because for the last few years I've been engaged with the question of realism in philosophy. And as David said, there's been a kind of revival of interest, which some of you may be aware of, in what's become known as speculative realism, the question of how we can think a reality that is not dependent on thought, a non-human reality. And I think there's a certain timeliness to this return to realism in that ecologically we're compelled to contemplate the prospect of a world without us. And therefore we're led to question the subjective tendency of much 20th century philosophy, which tended to focus on questions of the subjective constitution of knowledge rather than the real of which knowledge was a knowledge. So I'm not going to talk in detail about that, but just to say that there's this question of realism, and I suppose a number of chance encounters with artists that led me to start thinking about the way in which perhaps contemporary art has already thought through this question of realism in certain ways. It's already questioned the limitation of realism to the visual, the limitation of realism to an accuracy or an indexical relation. It's also, at the same time, acknowledged within a work an interrogation rather than an occlusion of the real status of the work itself, that the work is part of a reality outside its author's intentions, often bringing in materials, its material contingency, its connectedness to an outside. So through publishing the journal Collapse, I've come into contact with various contemporary artists who are interested in the way their work intersects with these philosophical concerns. And I'm going to talk about John Gerrard, whose work I think has a very immediate and obvious realism, as we saw it with one of his works that we saw at the beginning there. But as I'll try to show, I think this realism is one that goes far deeper than its superficiality, its image. Or in some ways, it's a deep realism because of its superficiality and the way that this immaculate surface in his work is produced. So I'm going to start with a video of a 2011 work based originally on these reference images. Hopefully I can get this to play.
This is a festival that sort of...
Do we have any sound?
...tradition boundaries between disciplines, and it is also sort of very interested in very ambitious collaborations. So I think the idea of pairing a choreographer with an artist is already kind of in the tradition of Manchester International Festival.
So this is at Manchester.
So I worked with a dancer called Davide De Pretore, and he rehearsed these actions, and then we brought him to a company in Prague who have what's called an optical tracking system. So he wears a very special suit, which has these little balls on it that are very luminescent, and the computer tracks the position of these balls in XYZ space. So what you get is you get a very precise record of maybe about 50 points in space on ankles and heads and arms, and then there's a special piece of software that sort of strings all these flows of information together to give you an accurate set of positions. We built a virtual portrait of this dancer, and that's the figure you're seeing, the sort of everyman soldier figure is the dancer. And then he can choose from these kind of vast motion capture data pots to make the actions in real time. So he makes these scenes as he goes along. All the actions of the soldier are mimicking the actions of soldiers releasing mortar fire. So, that's all the crouching. So I found several thousand images of soldiers releasing bombs, and they have this very particular set of actions that they do, crouching, sheltering. So the choreography in a traditional sense, the shapes are derived from military documentation.
I think it's very impressive.
Okay.
I saw it from a...
We won't listen to the audience response. Okay. So I'm going to start off just briefly talking about the way in which this brings together a global technologized violence, the control of the body, choreography, which is increasingly a part of John's work, which was not always the case. There weren't always human forms in the work, but also, I think, a certain note of tragedy, perhaps, in what I would call a Beckettian sense. So I'm going to read from a short text I wrote at the time, which sums up for me the link between the world John is becoming interested in, the peculiar convergences of military precision, choreography, performance, spectacle, and simulation that seem to be an inherent part of contemporary power, and the delusional way, in a sense, in which this infinitude, this infinite vocabulary, this inexhaustible figure contrasts with what we actually know about the resources of the world and the situation of the human race. So in his account of the architecture of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, I.L. Wiseman recounts that in the late 70s, Ariel Sharon's partner in developing the crypto-militarized spatial logic of the West Bank settlements was Avraham Wachman, co-inventor of the Eshkol-Wachman movement notation, a system for writing dance, which realizes literally the notion of a choreography, the writing of dance. In Wiseman's observation, Sharon's plan for the colonization of the West Bank emerged out of the meeting of the architect of dance notation with the architect of maneuver warfare, and Wachman's subsequent protestation that political violence can be unproblematically separated from the spatial and material practices through which it's exercised. In this contention, we can already read some of the stakes of infinite freedom exercise. As soon as a graphism, a writing, provides a function of notational recording, it produces a virtual space of infinite exercise. So the very concept of writing is continuous with the creation of an in principle inexhaustible virtuality. And as Badiou has pointed out, in the Turing machine, Alan Turing's theoretical prototype of every computing machine extant today, in the Turing machine, the infinite potential of carrying out any operation whatever is grounded, theoretically, on a real infinity. In Turing's machine, the availability of a limitless length of tape used to record and read data. And I think our spontaneous attitude today, faced with today's virtual spaces and their extension into reality, is to collude with this supposition of infinite availability. So the seduction of these spaces of procedural graphism, whether literary or electronic, tends to occult their relation to the outside. So what happens if we think about a realism of the virtual? We would have to address, on the one hand, an energetics or an economics of virtuality, accepting that every virtuality is dependent on a source of energy. On the other hand, the metaphorical transport that makes the abstract space of writing a real agent in the world it sought to notate. Such a realism would refuse the representationalism that claims that virtual worlds are mere models, whether descriptive or prescriptive, exercises, practices, games, simulations. Now, literary notation becomes obsolete. That is, the dance notation on paper becomes obsolete when digital technology can meticulously motion capture every significant aspect and movement of a body. In infinite freedom exercise, the performer, like the landscape, follows a text assembled Frankenstein-like but seamlessly out of the data trails of anonymous sources. An oil refinery burning uncontrolledly. In fact, I think this didn't feature in the final work, but it was a part of the initial inspirational image. An oil refinery burning uncontrolledly, as inexhaustible as the technology that allows its depiction, belches smoke in the distance. The uncanny perdurance of this scene and its tirelessly graceful inhabitant suggests the originary violence of virtuality in a world where its exercise has become inextricable from reality and where its infinite freedom has become a political model and the case for war. This is a background against which I now want to discuss some of John's earlier works, and I think from the point of view of today, we can call it a completed cycle of his earlier work. And it begins with this work, Lufkin. The artist himself calls them portraits. These isolated, enigmatic structures, whose interiors remain hidden, are real sites, their surface captured by John Gerrard in thousands of digital photographs. These are actually the photographs, which are virtually indistinguishable from the virtual models, in fact. But these are the photographs of the sites. These photographs are then employed in a painstaking virtual reconstruction. The mastery of the medium that Gerrard and his production team have developed enables him to distance their work from any conspicuous emphasis on its new media credentials and their cultural associations, while utilizing software designed for intensively interactive gaming environments. The works revoke the gamer's freedom of movement to explore virtual space. Their immaculately rendered environments refuse to deliver the vertiginous fly-throughs, descents, and dizzying perspectives that movies have taught us to associate with CGI, leading us instead on slow orbital paths around isolated structures which offer a bare minimum of action. Nevertheless, much of the significance, I think, of Gerrard's work pivots on the technical nature of its medium. The digital computer and its generalized capacity to model any system whatsoever is the crucial enabler, not only of the hyper-realistic rendering of his subjects, but also of the globally coordinated networks of production and distribution that they invite us to consider. Accordingly, these portraits embody a tension between a realism that's pictorial, illusionistic, offering us a precise image of a reality remote-controlled by virtualities, and a realism that would liquidate the artwork's autonomy, reminding us that the work, too, is of that same reality. In this sense, the work can be seen to span two moments, precisionist and literalist, of a specifically American realism. That is, a realism allowing the artist to subtract himself from European artistic tradition, the subtraction necessary to address the new realities, themselves quintessentially American, of a world dominated by objects and environments that appear as uncanny, alien presences. A realism, then, for those realities of a new world whose aesthetic and social meaning has not yet crystallized. Charles Shaler records that his exposure to European avant-garde painting at the 1913 Armory Show provoked a realization that, quoting, "A picture could be as arbitrarily conceived as the artist wished." Shaler abandoned his early painterly experimentation, however, instead developing a rigorous realism in his recording of the industrialization of the American landscape. This is the style that will become known as Precisionism, characterized by its exaggerated sensitivity to machined forms and their sharply delineated geometrical unmodulated surfaces. The pursuit of precision was also determined by Shaler's professional involvement in photography. The formal qualities accentuated by photography, diverging from those emphasized by pictorial tradition, hasten the conclusion that rather than exploring the essential elements of the pictorial through painterly experiment, one might instead discover the articulations of the real by, as Shaler says, removing the method of painting as far as possible from being an obstacle in the way of considering the content of the picture. Working as a commercial photographer, Shaler was commissioned in 1927 by an advertising agency to document Albert Kahn's 1,100-acre Ford Red River plant in Michigan, then the largest industrial complex in the world. The plant was the product of a new, heavily planned functional architecture of production, devised by Ford engineers, for increased efficiency. The single-story, steel-framed, glass-walled structures, free of all superfluous adornment, ensured that, to quote, the imperatives of management were conveyed not merely by foremen, but by the architecture of the workplace. Shaler's passion for his subject here, he called it incomparably the most thrilling I have had to work with, is reflected in the heroic cast of the images, which would be a determining moment in the development of his later painting. Contemporary critics shared Shaler's own understanding of his style as essentially American. Its ultimate literalness, as they said, its extremely simplified realism, was seen as echoing the clear-cut fineness, the cool austerity, the complete distrust of superficialities, the complete distrust of superfluities of the Shaker furniture that Shaler so adored, as much as the industrial might of the Red River plant. In the former, as in the latter, Shaler was to divine a classicism, he says, that he associates with Greek sculpture's facade of realism, behind which is skillfully concealed an ideal structure. So that despite Shaler's claim that, as he says, my things don't go beyond the boundaries of the actual, Precisionism ultimately is an idealism. Its crystalline semi-abstractions argue that the corn silos, factories, and machines generated through the sole concern for function and efficiency participate in the same spirit as the early products of American handicraft. And Shaler says that he requires every picture should have a steel structure. He also requires, however, that the steel structures of his subjects be understood as extensions of a nobler armature. The high point of Precisionism is 1940s series Power, Shaler's series of paintings commissioned for a Fortune magazine feature that breathlessly vaunts the marvels of technology to a still largely rural American public. Fortune was cautious enough about Shaler's work at this time, which was by then attracting criticism for its affectless representations. Not only to head the article with the one painting in the series that features pre-20th century technology, a water wheel entitled Primitive Power, but also to equip the reader in advance with a reassuring interpretation of the remainder. This is what Fortune says. Shaler shows them to be for what they truly are, not strange, inhuman masses of material, but forms that are deeply human. They trace the firm pattern of the human mind as it seeks to use cooperatively the limitless power of nature. In the text alongside Shaler's Yankee Clipper, his cropped portrait of an aeroplane propeller becomes a symbol of identity and popular freedom. The text says, "The people of the US have achieved their latest and greatest freedom through the use of power. The internal combustion engine has given them a new and highly personal mobility. It allows a man to go as he pleases. He loses old realities and gains new ones. The internal combustion engine has suddenly expanded his adventure in space. Shaler has expressed the new portent in this poised and infinitely precise propeller." At the same time, however, in the text, the propeller can be read as threatening the usurpation of the artist by the engineer. The airplane, it says, is the highest art of the engineer. His, like all great art, is an art that largely conceals itself. Shaler believes that the pursuit of function reveals principles of beauty that will retrospectively absorb those of the restricted practices of art. And yet, this is paradoxically conjoined with an attempt to redeem functional beauty through an art that measures itself for this task by erasing all trace of its mediation. Doesn't this uneasy alliance merely hold at bay the more fundamental shift in the relation between art and the real that such infinitely precise creations call for? Thierry de Douve recounts that in 1912, Duchamp, who had not yet invented the ready-made, went to the Salon de la Locomotion Aérienne, and to Léger and Brancusi, who were accompanying him, he offered this verdict: "Paintings washed up. Who'll do anything better than that propeller? Tell me, can you do that?" This designation, ready-made, of Blériot's airplane and propeller as, quoting de Dove, worthy of supplanting painting under the title of art, of course anticipates Duchamp's ambiguous declaration that the only works of art America has given are her plumbing and her bridges. Duchamp seconds Fortune's recognition of what de Duve describes as the immanent and involuntary beauty of the modern machine adapted to its function. But Shaler's representation of this new art still retains a certain autonomy of means beyond mere selection and nomination. That is, representation for Shaler is still necessary, even as he strives to negate this mediation so as to reveal the underlying structure of the new aesthetic. Shaler's dogged pursuit of this goal renders his work at once urgent and opaque. The subtraction of all facture and ornament presses the viewer against the real, as if willing it to secrete some clue as to its inner structure. But its faithfully reproduced cryptic surfaces seem to offer no satisfaction. In his 1965 essay, Specific Objects, Donald Judd sets out the motivations and the criteria for a new art that would escape the constraints of both painting and sculpture. Recent work having consigned these given forms to a determinate lifespan, as Judd puts it, we need to look to works which, no longer generating autonomous, illusionistic space, now inhabit 3 dimensions, real space, whose materials are simply materials, used directly, aren't obviously art, and whose qualities are no longer determined by the relation of their parts, since they tend towards singleness, being an entity, one thing. And Judd contends that this, what he calls new 3-dimensional work, moves towards the possibility of artworks that are nothing more than themselves, qua specific objects. In a famous critique of this position, Michael Fried finds the most important clue to the stakes of Judd's literalism, or as it would later be called, minimalism, in Tony Smith's anecdote of driving the unfinished New Jersey Turnpike. Smith says, this drive was a revealing experience. The road and much of the landscape was artificial, and yet it couldn't be called a work of art. On the other hand, it did something for me that art had never done. Its effect was to liberate me from many of the views I had had about art. It seemed that there had been a reality there that had not had any expression in art. The experience on the road was something mapped out, but not socially recognized. I thought to myself, it ought to be clear that that's the end of art. Most painting looks pretty pictorial after that. There's no way you can frame it. You just have to experience it. Judd, then, insists on liberating art from its painterly and sculptural circumscription through a confrontation with the literal object, and, of course, in Judd's work, through repetition. Robert Morris, at the same time, argues that the inexhaustible number of possible relationships between viewer and object becomes a part of the work in a minimalist situation. But what Fried wants to argue is that we can squarely align these claims with Smith's non-art experience of driving the turnpike. In effect, Fried claims that the former is merely an encrypted form of the latter, that what Judd and Morris invoke is the same experience, quoting Fried, of endlessness, of inexhaustibility, of being able to go on and letting the material itself confront one in all its literalness, its objectivity, its absence of anything beyond itself. So according to Fried, the literalist work is a compaction of the deracinating but somehow exhilarating experience of inhabiting a system of objects whose forceful but meaningless presence seems to obtrude on experience from elsewhere, an object reality without semantic or social correlation, and therefore hollow. Precision engineered to be nothing but what it is, permuting the facts of modern reality, as Fried says. We might say that the specific object invites the hypnotic fascination enjoyed by that man in a car driving on a concrete highway to an unknown destination, nominated by J.G. Ballard as the key image of the 20th century. Perhaps a more appropriate 21st century image would be that of a teenager wrapped before the screen as a console unfolds from its memory chip tracts of virtual highway, producing in a state of total immobility the endless and vacuous interest that Fried derides so strongly in Judd's objects. As Fried anticipates, the form of experience he identifies has become so common as to be banal for us. The best indicator of this would be the uncontested hegemony of various derivatives of techno, that music originating in the Motor City, Detroit, and which, abandoning form and development, consists apparently of laminar, repetitive continua that the listener enters and leaves arbitrarily. Thinking of Smith's turnpike experience, this is perhaps best exemplified by the British duo Orbital, who, in homage to Kraftwerk's seminal electronic highway hymn Autobahn, named themselves after the M25. For the inexhaustibility of the literalist object is precisely of the orbital type. According to Fried, the intensity of the encounter it embodies, the speed of the turnpike cruise, engenders a hallucinatory sensation of progression and repletion, whereas in fact, the literal is inexhaustible only, according to Fried, because there is nothing there to exhaust. Fried says, it's endless the way a road might be if it was circular, for example, which is why it must be polemically opposed by the work of art, whose value lies precisely in its ability to defeat or suspend its objecthood by generating autonomous spaces. Smith's turnpike, I was just going to add here, it was after I wrote this that I read an interview with John Gerrard where he says his understanding of the medium that he works in is profoundly orbital. I think it was very interesting that he chose that word as well. Smith's turnpike experience, then, is conditioned by the reorganization of the environment through the mass production of modular, repetitive forms. Entry into this environment is marked by new modes of experience, those which, according to Fried, most deeply excite literalist sensibility, and that literalist artists seek to objectify in their work by the repetition of identical units. Unlike in Shaler's quest for ideal classical form, this order, according to Judd, is not rationalistic and underlying, but is simply order, like that of continuity, one thing after another. What Fried calls literalism's theatricality, then, consists precisely in its relaying modernity unreflectively, since it's already corrupted or perverted by it. It lies in its submission to its seductive, cryptic threat or promise of inundation by alien objects. And it relays this in a way which Shaler was unable to do. In his 1966 account of a car trip with Judd, The Crystal Land, Robert Smithson replays Tony Smith's Epiphany, reimagining the production of these forms as glacial, inorganic terrestrial processes. Smithson further develops the link between the machined industrial environment and the nature of the literalist object, whose creation he reimagines as an unnatural crystallization, putting space down in the form of deposits. Following a glaciologist's statement that ice is the medium most alien to organic life, Smithson observes how the highways crisscross through the towns and become man-made geological networks of concrete. In fact, The entire landscape has a mineral presence, from the shiny chrome diners to glass windows of shopping centres. A sense of the crystalline prevails. At this point, where mankind is besieged, like the hero of Ballard's contemporaneous crystal world, by some uncontrolled inorganic infestation, it's no longer a question of tethering this adventure in space, in which man loses old realities and gains new ones, to some kind of social project. Beyond Shaler's complicity with the symbolic domestication of the machine, and Duchamp's nomination of it as art, the literalist object now indexes something mapped out in advance, but which is no longer for us. An alien regulation and reorganization of space. And this sentiment is attested to not only by Smithson's candid associational reading of Judd's work. He says, the first time I saw Don Judd's pink plexiglass box, it suggested a giant crystal from another planet. But also, for instance, by the work of John McCracken, whose account of his own work slides easily from their existing between two worlds of illusionist painting and three-dimensionality to being actual alien life forms from another dimension or from the future, channeled by the artist. Not to mention, of course, the impenetrable, cosmically cryptic monolith, Morris-like space station of Stanley Kubrick's 2001. So it's in the context of this development, and finally in the context of Smithson's journey, with its affect of inundation by the inorganic, that we can come back to John's work. In the context of Smithson's journey, he finds what he says is a grey factory in the midst of it all that looked like architecture designed by Robert Morris. In this context, we can offer an interpretation of John Gerrard's methodology. In particular, the facility that features in Grow Finish Unit was spotted soon after Gerrard had visited the artillery sheds at Judd's Chinati Foundation at Marfa. This contingent double encounter of Judd's permanently installed serial forms and those deposited in the landscape by agro-industry gives a supplementary dimension to Gerrard's selection. The isolated, silently operating production site, and just to give you a bit of detail about what this structure is, piglets are delivered here. They're fed automatically by the hoppers, and their waste flows into a lake which is next to it. And then a few months later, someone comes back and collects them, and in between, it's unmanned. And these are placed in the corners of the fields which have the circular irrigation system that goes round. So they use up the unused parts of the Midwest, which aren't reached by the irrigation. So this isolated, silently operating production site, I would suggest, functions as a synecdoche for a system that re-synthesizes the planet's resources and reconfigures space according to a functional criteria that ultimately has very little to do with humans. But the site is not merely an allegory or a symbol of the type found in Shaler's Power series. It's simultaneously a literalist ready-made, just like the factory that Smithson found in his car trip. This duality corresponds to a splitting within the work that obviates or at least complicates its apparently theatrical nature. Because Gerrard's reconstructed model itself no less than virtualizes the entire literalist situation, fast-forwarded through its evolution into monumental land art. The recurring camera path orbiting the building at walking pace automates the viewer's inexhaustible surveying of the permanent installation. The impenetrability in principle of the superficially reconstructed building and the durational nature of its virtual environment re-emphasize this inexhaustibility. But this proxy experience is complicated by the physical form of a work that constitutes both its technical support and an installation into which it's embedded. So this is an installation shot in the installation of Cuban School at Simon Preston Gallery in New York. A Morris-esque slab is suspended parallel to the wall of a thickness that makes it a volume rather than a mere screen. The digital projection is precisely congruent with the face of this white monolith. So the projected image vacillates between being a portal, a view into another world, an autonomous space, and a superficial covering. So the theatrical situation of literalism, including its beholder, in the form of the virtual camera viewpoint, is set at a distance, and the archetypal minimalist hollow volume becomes a host body, a vehicle freighted with the illusionist space that literalism wanted to liquidate. The doubling of the real 3D presence of the screen volume and the virtual 3D presence of the school is further echoed by the similar dimensions of the space itself, which, for the purposes of designing the installation, was itself modelled using the same software. Tony Smith's 1962 work, Black Box, implies a relation between the enigmatic hollowness of the minimalist object and the cybernetic conception of a modular processing unit whose mechanism, accessible through input and output ports, is sealed off and closed from view, a black box. This hint indicates, I think, the shortcomings of Judd's conception of objectivity in terms limited to physical and spatial presence. In order to participate in reality, an object must be considered not just as a spatial unit, but in its productive interactions with the environment. Furthermore, any contemporary conception of space must take into account the non-physical but effectively real electronic spaces that increasingly organize and reformat physical space. This expanded notion of objecthood is insisted upon most strongly in the other form in which Gerrard's work is presented, the physical presence and gravity of what he calls his art boxes, formerly floor-standing tables fabricated in the featureless, abstract, white industrial material Corian, more recently wall-mounted forms in rolled steel, which decisively prevent the works from being read as merely virtual. At the same time, the on-screen virtual environment makes it inevitable that the hollowness of the white box is perceived and experienced as being full, filled out with circuitries, hooked up to the grid, becoming a black box. Fittingly for works that are the result of a collaboration across many disciplines, industrial design, software engineering, CGI modeling, a piece like Lufkin conspicuously exposes its complicity in the same network of production and in the same contingent history of geosynthesis as the industrial facilities it depicts. This draws attention, in my reading, to the pervasive technological illusion of freedom from time and contingency that is the essence of the heightened literalist experience of its virtual mise-en-scène, while the virtual scene uses the digital medium to accentuate the implacable, apparently limitless cycles of industrial technology. The installation reveals it, along with the digital black box and the art object itself, as synthetic, finite, and resource-consuming. From the silent processing that happens in the 7-month interim between the delivery of piglets and their pickup, to the slow-motion plutonic vampirism of the oil pump, Gerrard recognizes that to properly consummate the literalist encounter with the alien requires that this synthetic, processual, and ultimately finite aspect of the object also must be brought to the surface. Gerrard's two 2011 works, Cuban Schools, share with earlier work the aspect of being entities from outside, Space Invader-like. The buildings crouch on concrete feet that give the impression they've just landed. But from which alien planet? From what dimension? The schools belong to a period of the island's history when the optimism of early revolutionary socialist models of housing gave way to large-scale mass housing models. This phase began with the US embargo and the need for high-tech solutions to see through the revolutionary project. And a decisive moment came in 1963 with Hurricane Flora, after which there was the building of a large panel concrete prefabrication factory in Santiago. Over the following decade, a growing network of prefabrication facilities throughout Cuba slowly locked in the commitment to this technology. The socialist project, in fact, became virtually synonymous with state-centralized fabrication. But the huge investments brought, at best, mixed results with very poor finish and dubious build. The infatuation with these capital-intensive prefabrication methods owed less to their results than to the notion that only industrialization would help Cuba escape underdevelopment. Industrial development as the cornerstone of the socialist revolution. But the stimulation of this situation and the exportation of architecture and planning were also part of a deliberate transformation of the post-colonial South, or the Third World, defined in relation to the socialist capitalist alternative, into a battleground in which technology transfer and knowledge distribution were ideological vehicles, and planning and architecture were exported as instruments of Cold War politics, in the belief that the organization of space and of dwelling could determine the political destiny of territories in the balance. It's no wonder then that in El Bloqueo, showed at the Third Havana Biennial, the Cuban artist Antonio Fernandez Tonel uses breeze blocks to spell out the work's title, which means the blockade or the embargo, but also, of course, the block, and to construct this squared-off map of Cuba. Made in the year the Berlin Wall fell, Tonel's work anticipates the problematic legacy of these imported Soviet models, whose forms left their impression on the lives of a whole generation in Cuba. It was Giron-style reinforced panel prefabrication that permitted the mass construction during the 60s and 70s of the SBECs, or the schools in the countryside, which are a very painful memory for Cuba's Generation Y. Of course, the brutal reality of life within these alien shells bore little relation to the principles supposedly embodied in their prefabricated slabs. When Soviet funding dried up, the shortcomings of the model were, of course, all too evident. So the question of actually existing versus real socialism here is perhaps subsidiary to that of the sacrifice of the contingency of place in history to the prefabrication of ideological models. In aligning the incongruous presence of the Cuban schools, appropriate emblems for this attempted political remote control, with the equally remote-controlled industrial facilities of his previous work, Gerrard reflects on the universality of the functionalist legacy of modernism. Because we live today among the ruins of the belief that in the fascinating formal possibilities that emerge from new technology, there is a latent possibility of twisting free of tradition and creating forms of life that, since they directly confront reality, are universal. Of course, the Fordist principles of utility and efficiency, embodied hyperbolically in industrial facilities, such as the Grow Finish unit, belong to the same Fordism that was instrumental in exporting structures for living, and that employed precisionist painting to promote its efficiencies. But we should also recall the close relation between literalism and constructivism's transformation of art into production through the extirpation of ideologies. Its effects are as manifest in the Cuban schools as in the literalist object. Furthermore, the depersonalized and de-ideologized productions of constructivism, informed by the precepts of tectonics, that is, exploitation of the newest materials and techniques, facture, the non-bourgeois use of materials, and construction, the efficient and functional fabrication, aimed to produce in their proletarian audience precisely the same type of excitement described by Freed as theatrical. Like Smith and his students on the Turnpike, this audience, the Soviet audience, was supposed to come face to face with a real that was beyond anything art had previously had to offer, to enter directly, participatively into it, rather than contemplating and reflecting on its meaning. From this point of view, it's instructive that immediately after the recounting of his turnpike experience, Smith moves from these Ballardian wastelands, he talks about abandoned airstrips, artificial landscapes, created worlds without tradition, to the architecture of Le Corbusier, praising it as a similarly accessible experience of a reality that breaks the circumscribed bounds of art. Le Corbusier, who, like Shaler, discerned a classical beauty in what he calls the American grain elevators and factories, the magnificent first fruits of the new age, and whose call for standardization, industrialization, taylorization as the most urgent program of town planning echoed from east to west during the 20th century. The dream of an art equal to the real itself always addresses itself to a type that it hopes to engender, either a rational observer who discerns an ideal order, or a pragmatist who sees works of art as nothing more than objects and acts on material facts. What Freed identifies as that which excites literalism can't be reduced to merely a matter of experience, conviction, sensibility, for it also provided the stimulus, the fascinated compulsion that drove nations to participate enthusiastically in the construction of crystal lands and of monoliths. So Freed's question is apt. If the turnpike, airstrips, and drill grounds are not works of art, what are they? What is the nature of this reality that compels art to respond to it, that seems to run of its own accord without human intervention, and of the depiction of which Shaler says, perhaps only half-jokingly, it's my illustration of what a beautiful world it would be if there were no people in it. They are the ruins of something whose cryptic promise seduced the human race into assisting in its emergence, but which conspicuously failed to engender a new human to inhabit it. The Cuban schoolwork has one person in it, caretaker. She walks out twice a day to switch the lights on and to switch the lights off. I think of her as a caretaker tending to the enigmatic remainders of this hope. In the works whose realism, this time, announces itself explicitly as temporal, finite, and synthetic. Thank you.
Complex talk. So you normally just start by saying if there are any questions out there. Are there any questions? Are you thinking of anything? I say, Robin, as to get back to Falmouth tonight, so you would not be making it to the bar. So if you want to ask a question, maybe I can start.
Yeah.
So I was kind of interested. I have formed some preconceptions about what this talk might be, and I was very interested that you start to how you start to run the theme of precision through the history of art, coming through to literalism. As a kind of autonomy, or a kind of autonomous world that's not art, that equates with the real. But if someone said to you that minimalism is kind of understood as the moment when the body enters art by most people, it kind of leads to another question I have. But you could to see these literalist artworks and these these precision spaces like the silo, as kind of autonomous. I'm wondering if that leads to a kind of fiction. That's my first question. And I would say that ruins only exist through a kind of fiction. So I was wondering about that, whether you would recognise that. But also in relation to body, I've always understood minimalism as being this discovery of, and maybe the Turnpike Road is a good example, of a kind of world being created by industry, which almost becomes something that evolves the body. You know, I could think of the Turnpike Road as a technology of speed, but also a vision in a way. And I was thinking that a lot about the turn from the industrial to the post-industrial to the digital. It's almost like we're going through an evolution. So the kind of I don't know. I find this quite fascinating. I don't know if this chimes with anything, but you're basically saying that there's a precision produced by thought, produced by kind of technology that humans produce, and they start to create a kind of a world that's inhuman, that's autonomous, a kind of sci-fi crystal world. But do you think it could, my reading of it could also be true that there's a kind of feedback loop aspect to it? And I certainly think that's what in minimalism happens with Smithson. Smithson's things are always activated by you. And I guess for me, I think very much about this watercolour that John Soane had commissioned about of the Bank of England in ruins in the future, because he was so narcissistic. He couldn't imagine his designs were as good as anything Roman or Greek people destroyed.
So he wanted to see it ruined.
And he imagines it in the future with these people walking through it. It seems to be a very fictional thing, ruins, which I kind of it's hard to equate with the ideal of a real that's autonomous and inhuman in a way. That was my. That's not that I'm not fascinated.
Yeah. Well, what are the ruins? The ruins are not the ruins of the structures. The ruins are the ruins of the hope that somehow this relationship, this theatrical relationship of excitation by the object, which is nothing more than what it is, will somehow produce a new human. And so the ruin is the ruin of that hope rather than the ruin of the structure. And yeah, I mean, I did talk about this duality of minimalism. I absolutely agree. It wants to do with this hyper-objectivity and to do with this activation, which is the theatricality that Freed talks about. And in a way, what I'm interested in doing is agreeing with Freed's diagnosis, but or agreeing with his reading, but disagreeing with his diagnosis, that therefore it's not interesting as art. I think that's precisely why it is interesting as art, is that there is this tension between the real and the theatrical experience of the real. So what I'm trying to do is then say, well, it's this affect, this theatrical experience, this excitation, which indexes something inhuman obtruding upon the human mind and human culture. So there's something that Freed has got hold of and in a way kind of airily dismissed.
But weirdly understood.
Yeah.
So just to, there are more questions now to give a thought, but just for me, so you are suggesting that to a certain extent this experience of the real does affect or not affect, does actually have some kind of effect on.
Yeah, but it's in a sense it's a more passive affect than the grand narratives of its hoped-for effect. Yeah, it's not. I'm not sure passive is the right word, but it's it involves a passion, exactly. Yeah.
And is it a kind of silencing maybe of the human?
Certainly, in the face of this, I mean, I think this is the first thing that people respond to in John's work is this kind of violence of these virtual structures that are our means of support and our empire, if you like, and yet they're in the middle of nowhere, unmanned, desolate, and they have this kind of eerie presence.
They might be unmanned, but there is a woman who comes through several nights.
Oh yeah, in the Cuban school, yeah. No, she lives there, I think, in this piece. I mean, in a way, it wasn't a good idea to start with the infinite freedom piece because that has a figure in it. And the use of human figures and the use of motion capture in John's work has kind of happened over the last couple of years. And the most recent piece he did is almost entirely of human forms. So then it becomes something quite different, I think. But that's why I kind of wanted to talk about this as being a completed cycle. I think the role of the humans in these pieces when they appear is ambiguous, and I don't think he quite knew what he was doing with the people or what their role was, but he was interested in kind of making that leap, which takes it beyond the minimalist object. Yeah.
Really quick one. I would argue that you gave us two examples, Ballon's example of the dude in a car on the road, which of course relates to the turnpike, the real as something which is experienced. And the contemporary example you gave us, the teenager on an iPad staring into the infinite of the net. But I think also in terms of the real, those two things are really quantitatively quite different. Not fundamentally in terms of human experience, but especially given that you spoke so much about the materiality of the materials used to sort of build the real.
But are they so different? This is my whole point, and this is what I think is important and interesting about the way in which John presents his work, which could so easily be a complete... I mean, the fact that I'm showing it here betrays it in a way, because the whole point about his works are that they're not simply virtual experiences that you watch on any screen anywhere. They are presented as objects. And I think one of the points I'm trying to make is that there isn't that great a difference in the two experiences of a passionate engagement with a kind of abstract space.
Where he was taking pictures rather than in his reconstruction, do you know what I mean?
Sorry?
It would be a very different experience if I'd gone to that site rather than seeing it on a great big screen in an art place.
Yeah, but in terms of the objecthood and the interactions going on, if I'm playing Grand Theft Auto, if I'm actually driving, I'm engaged in a passionate relationship with an abstract space constructed by these processes I've been talking about, which is consuming energy from the Earth. So, in a sense, what I find compelling about John's work is that he presents the reality of the virtual and the virtuality of the real, and if not erases, kind of smears that boundary so that we reconsider the apparently infinite, inexhaustible nature of these virtual worlds. Yeah.
I was wondering how a video like this might survive if these spaces were to be renovated and upgraded, and so they were wanted there again as possible. If that would have an effect on the longevity of the video.
Yeah. First of all, I just got to say, I kind of regretted that I didn't put in more time right at the beginning to describe the medium of the works. But it is really important to know that they're not videos, they're not time-based works, they're not films. The images, the work itself is a virtual model, and the images are created and discarded 60 times every second. So there is no permanent image. It's being created all the time by this virtual model inside the computer. So I think that in itself is another subject, but it's a very different kind of image. As to, do you mean if we were to make another model of this and it had been painted up and looked nice, would it be different?
The actual physical space
Yeah.
were to be changed,
Right.
so that they were no longer replaced.
Yeah, that kind of touches on something that, in a way, I feel slightly uneasy with in John's work, which doesn't quite fit in with what I've said, that I don't really see how you can avoid it. And that is the fact that there is a certain kind of monumental quality, right? They are, in a sense, he's making these monuments to the 20th century that he's, the optimism that he's seen and the world that's now kind of slowly crumbling around our ears. So they do have a kind of monumental quality, and perhaps there's a certain kind of nostalgia involved in the predilection for a ruin. Having said that, once the works exist, I've actually never asked him how he thinks about the relationship between the work and the original site once the work is finished. But I guess that he would say that that relation ceases to be important at the moment that the work becomes a kind of autonomous thing in its own right. It's not. They are based on actual sites, but at the same time, they have a certain generic quality, And often, I think, in modelling, they will, again, we refer back to this question of monumentality. I think, details are changed. Although the models are built from extremely detailed photography of the actual sites, they're not meant to be absolutely accurate, like architects' walkthroughs. They're portraits with the kind of possible distancing that might suggest. So, if you paint someone's portrait and they die, I guess that would be the same question. And I don't know exactly how you'd answer it.
I would like to ask about the lack of speculation, because I tried to research a bit, speculative realism, and well understood that the place of speculative realism in philosophy is to give an option for philosophy to imagine beyond to imagine again what the real is beyond what we can experience it through the mediation of the senses or whatever society wants to. And those works look realist rather than real, and they look representational of certain ideas rather than speculative into what could have been. I'm wondering where that's the speculative, how can art be speculative, create reality that is beyond what would be mediated by representing what it is?
Well, what I've tried to say is that it's both. It's obviously it's representational. It's working at the highest level of representation possible, in a sense, using the most advanced technologies and the most precise modelling in order to represent. But at the same time, precisely the work wouldn't be interesting to me if that's all it did. And that other aspect of it, which is that the work's presenting itself as real and as part of the same networks and synthetic processes that it's talking about, is what interests me. There's that there are both of these levels of realism at work. But as to what does it, how does it address realities that aren't human? Is that the question?
No, I think you kind of answered. You said the synthetic reality is the reality that it creates.
Yeah.
In relation.
Yeah.
Right, I've recorded what you said because I don't really understand much of what you said, so forgive me if I seem stupid. But I don't really understand why this work is relevant or interesting, and it just reminds me of when my local city centre was going to have a new shopping centre, they did a video like that, and that's what it looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, John's always worked. Well, I think, he originally discovered this kind of technology when he was at the Ruskin, and he became interested in it. He made several pieces with what the technology was available at the time, and luckily he's quite a successful artist and is able to have a production team and to work at the cutting edge of what technology is available. So yeah, the earlier works don't look as good, but he's just working with whatever's available at the time. The question about whether it's interesting or relevant is a good question, because I think precisely, yes, your town centre redevelopment has been planned and executed using precisely these tools. Everything that you watch on TV using CGI has been made with these tools. The games that you play on PlayStation have been made using all the same processors. Our world is a world that runs on digital models. And what John has quite courageously done, I think, is to say, if I want to talk about this, the contemporary reality, I'm going to talk about it using the same language that it's subjecting us to every day. So I think precisely that's the interest in, that's why it's interesting, because it is similar to all these other things. Now you can then make your own judgment as to whether it does something worthwhile with that technology. But for me, I think what's interesting is the use of this technology in a way that is non-instrumental. So it's still...
Do you think that, because
yeah.
I think that's a brilliant thing to say, because realism has always been seen in the way that maybe you've articulated the problem, but it makes me wonder, is this not really more of a critical realism?
Critical realism.
Not so dissimilar from realism in the past, which I think is all that stuff you say about,
yeah.
Let's break the illusion of the infinite freedom we get. With cyberspace, because it's not, it's these objects, it's these materials. But do you think it's kind of fascinating because it brings you into contact with an experience of this world as an object, as its kind of reality, as one of its realities. But is that more of a critical?
I think perhaps one way of looking at it is certainly that it enables you a kind of distance from that technology and a different way of relating to it, which in one way you could say it was more passive, because you don't. In the early works, in fact, John did have devices where, as the viewer moved around the room, the scene would shift, and he very quickly cut those out. I think partly to do with wanting to distance himself from a new media art agenda, but also I think he discovered somehow that not being able to interact was more powerful than interacting. So yeah, I think that's certainly a way of reading it as well. But again, I'd say what would be interesting is that it's compacting all these different senses of realism at once. So it's creating a very kind of complex relation to the real.
We've probably got about 15 minutes left, and there are 3 questions on that side.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether you want to start in the front with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Talk a little bit more about non-human reality.
Yeah.
I think that's what you said. If I said that without human consciousness existing still, there would be no non-reality, at least until a computer became intelligent enough to pass its own tests.
There would be no reality. Well, there would be no computers left to become intelligent then. Yeah, that's precisely the position which, in theoretically speaking, speculative realism has tried to combat, is the human conceit that reality is formed, synthesized, substantively created by its human mediation. And there are various reasons. I mean, that, in a sense, though, I have to say at that point that speculative realism is kind of founded on a caricature of that position. I don't think that position, as such, ever existed in the history of philosophy, except in two circumstances. But it's a general tendency that philosophy in the 20th century has focused more on what we do with reality than trying to think reality itself. What was I going to say? Yeah, so there are several different reasons why it seems to have become imperative to re-establish this possibility of thinking a reality that would still be there if we weren't there. And to me, one of the most compelling reasons is that if we don't believe it's possible to do so, then all of scientific thought becomes essentially mysterious. We just don't, we don't understand why anything works. If we actually don't know anything about reality, then how do computers work? How does any built, engineered object work? Unless we understand scientists and engineers to be speaking about a real that would exist, whether we were there or not. So it becomes an extremely problematic proposition to make for many reasons. And therefore, I think, more and more people are interested in various ways. And it's not just one school of thought. There's various different ways in which people have tried to re-establish the possibility of human thought, thinking something that's not dependent on the human. And after all, it's not such an unreasonable proposition if you think about it, that humans are not the center of the universe. And also, as I said, I think there's a kind of timeliness to it, and the fact that, we're contemplating the planet without us. We're contemplating that real possibility right now. There's another question. Yeah.
I thought the last part of your essay was really compelling about talking about this caricature of this wordless space. But so what's interesting is that the case of Robert Smithson, when he writes Minus of Passaic, he travels to Passaic on the weekend, so there's no workers in specialized space. So he's allowed to make these fantastical claims on this area, right? And this is the thing with Charles Sheeler is that I think he's trying to depict a form of corporate realism. Right? That's like this fetishization of like the factory, which is devoid of workers. Right? So you're unable to speak of like a factory as a site of exploitation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I wonder, I guess what we could like. So I wonder the role of the workers in these spaces, especially with this case too.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is part of this kind of mysterious, thanatropic drive. Is how does a whole race become caught up in these machines and drained by them? I wonder whether looking at human beings would give us more of an answer than looking at the structures.
Well, I wonder, like in these spaces in Cuba, like these are not like ruinous states of like architectural monuments. Like they're used spaces.
Yeah.
They're activated by human beings.
Yeah.
Same with the factory. So the relationship between the worker and the manager,
Yeah.
which is obscured. For example, Charles Sheeler's.
But in a certain sense, a lot of these sites, anyway, are not activated by human presence. The oil pump, there's no one there. So in a way, the human agency and the agency of the worker is occluded in that in those spaces.
Needs maintenance, though, doesn't it?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, so human has to come back to it. It's not like
Yeah.
we all became extinct, it would just keep going and producing oil,
No.
it would just become a mess.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
It'll
a bit
go-
of a fallacy. The world without us is like a Schrodinger's cat thing, where, you know,
Carry on though.
anyway, I mean, it's like realism, the whole prospect, the concept of realism has to do with somebody there to perceive it. So, and is it like post-realism then? If there's no one to see the tree that falls in the forest or the cat that may or may not be dead in the books, do you know what I mean? It's that sort of problem.
Yeah, it's the problem of a kind of impossible viewpoint, and yet it's a...
the archifossil though, way of dealing with,
Yeah.
the glimpse of it, so that's kind of realism.
Yeah, of course, but the archifossil is a kind of rhetorical device presented in order to say, you know, scientists speak every day about, this is the same thing I was saying to the question over here, that scientists speak every day about realities which, of which there was no manifestation to any consciousness. You know, they talk about supernovas that happened 400 million years ago, then how are we able to even make sense of that without taking the leap of accepting that there are realities even when there are not humans there to perceive them? So that is a kind of, thinking about that kind of object is a kind of leverage to prompt us to understand that if we do take the position that nothing exists without being manifest to consciousness, we get ourselves into some serious problems. Yeah.
There's loads of questions I have to tell you.
That's okay. We can have a couple more. Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. Right.
I remember a piece of work by John Gerrard a while ago. That was at Canary Wharf.
Yeah. The oil stick work. Yeah.
The oil stick ones. And I was just wondering, like, all of these pieces that you've shown, and especially the one that I'm talking right now, there's always a strong presence of a person, even in this kind of utopian land that he's created with no man in it. But there's always this presence that can't be erased. I'm fine with that, but I want to know about what's John Gerrard's role in this kind of world. Like, is he still the artist anymore?
Okay, well, to be pedantic about it, the works up to oil stick work, there was never a human figure. Oil stick work was the first time he put a human figure. In that work, the man comes out of the barn and he's painting this barn with an oil stick, a tiny bits every day. And the work is programmed to last, I think, for 30 years, after which the barn will be completely painted. So yeah, there's this kind of Beckettian performance. And as I said, I think at that point the work begins to change because it brings in this kind of choreographic element and the question of the relation of the body to these remote controlling technologies. But as to John's role in the work, I think, yeah, I can answer that. I'm not sure interestingly, but I can answer it, is that his method is to just be in landscapes he finds interesting. He kind of just does research, finds somewhere he thinks has interesting potential, just drives in the landscape until he finds something that, you know, seems like a Gerrard ready-made. He takes literally thousands of photographs, very detailed photographs to the site, and then he supervises the reconstruction in the studio. He has a production team of 2 programmers. So, yeah, his role is really interesting because in one sense it's like a Duchampian role. It's a nomination. It's saying, you know, okay, this structure becomes a work. But then in another way, it's intensely pictorial. You know, it's capturing the entire scene, the ground, the sky, everything. No, none of them have ever had sound in. Mm.
And I was kind of surprised because I didn't know very much about speculative realism. Certainly about the kind of speculations that go on in the market and the way the kind of abstractions that might come about through finance capital. But kind of these spaces are like the post-industrial ruin, right? They're kind of virtual spaces. They may be depicting ruins in a way, but also they're not quite like that. And I wondered if you thought there was any way that that could be connected interestingly with the kind of dynamics of finance capital.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question. It's absolutely connected. You know, pork futures.
But then what about this return to figuration? Because unlike the minimalist object, which is not necessarily abstract, but it's non-figurative. And you get a kind of return to figuration here, even though it's not exactly documentary. It's more because they're kind of piecing together these things.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're so evacuated and almost abstract.
Mm.
I wonder what you think of this. I mean, quite surprisingly, makes that a more plausible form of
Right.
capacity.
Yeah, certainly the central point about these pieces is that the structures, the real structures out there in the world are already, in a certain sense, virtual. So as I said, it's to do with this kind of blurring of the virtual and the real. I've forgotten what the first point was now. Yeah. Oh, figuration, yeah. So, yeah. I mean, I'm really interested in that question is about whether figuration precludes minimalism. So, if you have a piece that has a figurative or pictorial element, does that preclude it from being a specific object in that sense? Does it preclude it from being nothing but what it is? Or is it possible to create a figuration that's also what it is and nothing else? And that's what I think John is presenting, is a kind of oscillation between something which is the autonomous space that Freed talks about, which is what art is supposed to do, is create this autonomous space. But at the same time, it's a machine that's plugged into machines that's forms a part of the typical contemporary reality of what we call the real. So. Well, reality is already virtual, but the virtual is already real. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a reproduction and figuration, but at the same time, it's adding another machine part, right? So it's flat with the rest of reality at the same time as having a pictorial representative relation to it.
Should not be more formal than kind of suggesting like this is a space that, whilst being also productive, is also kind of parasitic as well, right? Because of course it's left for its own function, but in the end it's not just providing sort of, human functioning, but it's also its existence has to rely on that, doesn't it? And there's something of a reflection of that in the work of art, because it is kind of like auto-productive in the way that it shows you the way that you might engage with this space is as a virtual kind of diagram or a map.
Right. Yeah. There's your answer. Yeah. No, I think what you're asking comes back in a way to this question of the monumental aspect and how that disrupts my reading of it, and I'm very aware of that. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I'm afraid we all have to. Well, I'll go on then. One more.
One more question. Well, could you take two?
Okay. Yeah.
Are they quick? Yeah, I was going to ask.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
I was
Sorry, not Sana. Sorry, but
I was thinking about the question of functionality in objects. And I wonder whether you mentioned maybe functional beauty as well, and I wonder whether this functional aesthetics, not just as a part of art history, but maybe whether from that perspective of that reality you talked about, of reality of the world without us, didn't imprint this functional.
Right, yeah. You mean where the...
perception of
Yeah.
every object
Right.
which is considered to be object of art, whether it's not sort of necessary part of every object of art which is to be created as what it is, function, as what it is.
Do you mean in terms of the human perception, perceptual apparatus?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether it wouldn't be already in our minds missing element in whichever object which was created even in art sort of area which we would perceive as a real, as a realism.
That's a complicated one. I'm not sure what to answer. There's a question kind of whether there's some suspicious weakness in the human perceptual apparatus that lays it open to being lured by this kind of repetitive, modular aesthetic. Yeah.
And in that sense, it's almost like, that's just speculation maybe, but
Yeah.
in the form of sort of just maybe virus
Yeah.
affecting
Yeah, totally.
perception
Yeah.
of needing that or
Yeah, that's exactly the way I'm thinking about it, really. Yeah. I think I do have to go, I'm afraid. Thanks very much. Sorry for whoever didn't get to ask a question.